Hello again, everyone. I think we've got the technology worked out for real this time. We're going to do something I wasn't planning on doing, but Brian inspired me while he was talking. And you actually do this all the time. So I'm going to ask you to do it now. So he starts his classes with a recitation of Gerard Manley Hopkins' Pied Beauty. Yes? So sometimes. Well, I'd like everybody to stand up. We're going to do it together. I'm going to pass the microphone to you. Read it over real quickly. Because there's a lot of extra syllables.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So Jolie's calling me out here. I was going to do something like this afternoon, but we'll do it together. So my classes all start with poetry. No matter what I'm teaching, we learn poetry together. That's somehow ancillary to the class. And we typically do it in the poetic mode, so my students never see the actual words. But it doesn't really matter. We've got the words here, and I don't have you for 6 months in a class, so I've got you for 60 seconds here. All right? So let's do Pied Beauty together. I'll do a line, you do a line. Okay? Okay? Glory be to God for dappled things. For skies of couple color as a brinded cow. For rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. Fresh fire cold chestnut falls. Finch's wings. Landscape plotted and pieced. Fold, fallow, and plow. And all trades their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter original spare strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how? With swift, slow. Sweet, sour. A dazzle dim. He fathers forth. Whose beauty is past change. Praise him. There you go. Yeah.
He didn't know I was going to ask him to do that. So this is how a lot of rhetoric classes actually begin, and how I've started some of my rhetoric courses over the years. So I thought I'd give you a little taste of what it's like. I usually call on an unsuspecting student. Which is really kind of funny in this case because he was my teacher when I worked on my master's. So now I'm the teacher. So, all right, let's go over here. All right, today we're going to talk about rhetoric. So logic and rhetoric, my two favorite things to talk about with faculty, two favorite courses to teach. I'm very excited to have an opportunity to chat with you about both of them today. Today's talk is titled From Eloquence to Ethos, Teaching Rhetoric for Full, Faithful Engagement. And Sarah, who's here earlier, she helped me come up with the title, so I can't even take credit for all of the wonderful alliterations. But I'm grateful you're here because this isn't going to just be another lecture about a classical subject. It's an invitation to reconsider how we prepare students not only for academic success, but for cultural engagement, spiritual clarity, and a loving witness in the world that we live in. So here's a little bit about what we'll cover, just 4 quick things. What rhetoric really is and why its true nature is deeply Christian. 2 major problems in student writing that rhetoric can help solve. What Os Guinness calls the prejudice against persuasion and how his book Fool's Talk reclaims persuasion as Christian love. And how we can raise students who aren't just eloquent but courageous and gracious and truthful. So it'll be a little bit of a blend of both practical and spiritual in some ways, and we're here to not just talk about techniques alone, but to talk about truth and how to speak it in a world that often prefers illusions. You're going to notice that I'm going to talk about Os Guinness's book quite a bit. I have it here if you want to flip through it at some point. He is a Christian author and a cultural thinker who spent decades helping believers understand how to live and speak the truth in a world that often resists it. He was born in China to missionary parents. He's lived through actual revolutions, taught at some of the most influential institutions in the West, and written over 30 books, and including Fool's Talk and Art of Christian Persuasion. What makes him compelling for us is this. He sees persuasion not as manipulation or salesmanship, but he sees it as an act of love, a call to speak truth beautifully and winsomely in a truth-resistant world. And he reminds us that our kids won't just need to know what they believe. They'll need to know how to talk to people who don't believe as they do, and how to do that without fear, without pride, and without compromising their beliefs. So that's why I'm going to be quoting him throughout this talk. His insights are sharp, but more importantly, they're just full of grace. He reminds us that persuasion is not power, it's hospitality. It's not argument for argument's sake. It's a defense of the one that we love. So we're going to begin by defining what we mean when we use the word rhetoric. Has anybody memorized Aristotle's definition of rhetoric? A couple, maybe, no? I always have students memorize this at the beginning of our rhetoric classes. The faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. I'm going to say that again. The faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. We're going to break this down a little bit. It's not just about speaking well or writing clearly. It's about discerning how best to persuade depending on the audience, the context, and the message. In that simple definition, Aristotle gives us 3 crucial clues as to what rhetoric is. First of all, rhetoric is observational. It actually requires attentiveness to what's going on around you and who's there. You will change your message depending on who your audience is and what they need. So first and foremost, if you are going to be good at writing, good at persuading, good at rhetoric in any way, you have to stop, slow down, and observe. It's the faculty of observing around you. Then it's contextual. There are different cases. The faculty of observing in any given case, right? Different cases call for different tones, different inflections, different examples, different, sense of serious gravitas or a little bit more lighthearted. But you have to consider the case that we're in. And then the last one is it's oriented towards persuasion, not simply information, but moving someone. The faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. This is why rhetoric is such a useful discipline. Whether your student is going to be writing for a theology class, a literature class, political science paper, giving a business pitch, explaining a historical event, they are going to need to be able to persuade. Even lab reports and science proposals benefit from persuasive clarity. The deeper question is, why persuade at all? Persuasion, just the term itself, presumes disagreement. You don't persuade someone who already agrees with you. The word itself assumes that there are 2 minds at work, one trying to bring the other one along. And that's where classical rhetoric begins to overlap with Christian virtue, because to persuade well, the speaker must not only know something, but love someone. Rhetoric isn't just about the logic. It also involves the pathos, which is that empathy, and the ethos, which is the credibility. It's a whole person skill, mind, heart, and character. That's why classical rhetoric insists that good persuasion begins with understanding your audience and caring about them. not to manipulate them, but to honor them. Here's where Os Guinness comes in. In Fool's Talk, he warns us that our culture doesn't trust persuasion anymore. We live in what he calls a prejudice against persuasion. People don't just resist truth, they resist the very idea that someone should attempt to persuade them. He writes, we are not salespeople, we are not marketers, and we are not propagandists. We are persuaders, but persuaders who are ambassadors, not conquerors. That word ambassadors is so important because it shifts the whole posture of a speaker, of a writer. Ambassadors don't coerce. They don't enter rooms with swords or slogans. They come as dignified representatives seeking peace, not power. And this is what our students must become, not merely defenders of arguments, but ambassadors of the truth. We have a few problems when I've seen my students come through the different rhetoric programs, and we usually start rhetoric in some amount of it in 10th grade. There's usually Rhetoric 1, and that's where students learn the 5 canons of rhetoric and all the common topics, and all, they start putting their different speeches together and practicing. And then in Rhetoric 2, we usually practice different kinds of declamations and speech analysis and all sorts of things. And then for their 12th grade year, their senior year, this is where everybody writes a senior thesis. And I have seen more senior thesis papers and students getting up for 15 minutes and talking, and they don't persuade anyone at all. There's an arrogance. There's a few of these problems which I'll go through here, but there's a real issue that comes through in that we've formed them to be really great at wielding the pen as a sword instead of actually becoming folks who care about other people and persuading them in love. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the problems that I've seen. The first one is preaching to the choir. Is that a phrase that you all have here? Okay, good. Some of, you never know what idioms are just going to not work. The first major issue I see in student writing, especially from Christian students, is that they write as if their audience already agrees with them, and they are just looking for high fives when they get done writing that paper or off the stage, right? Some of you be like, yeah, you tell them, right? That's exactly right. They preach to the choir. They use shorthand language, loaded terms, moral assumptions that might make sense within a particular classroom, but they don't connect with anyone outside of it. And they don't realize that they're doing it. Worse, some students write for the applause, not for persuasion. They're trying to win the approval of either their teacher or their ideological tribe, rather than persuade someone who might actually see the world differently. What's missing, I think, is, and I don't think it's done maliciously, I don't think that they know that there's a humility and a nuance and the willingness to begin with common ground. And this is where virtue formation is so important, and this is part of how they're going to be shaped in virtue, just going through the writing process. So it's not purely academic, it's also formational for them as well. In this context, repeating talking points or quoting scripture out of context, it really doesn't persuade, it isolates the student. So they need to write like someone who's lost in the woods. Like they are writing for someone that they love and they want to bring home again. So here's an analogy that I often use with my students. And I ask them to think, if your best friend they went off by themselves, they shouldn't have. They knew they shouldn't have. Maybe they didn't know they shouldn't have, but they did. They went off by themselves. Now they're hopelessly lost out there. What do? Do you stand on your front porch and just hurl insults at them? I can't believe how stupid you are. How could you do this? Where did you go? How come you didn't know better? No, if you really care about the person, you form a search party. You don't want this person to be lost. You gather together, you go meet them where they are. You go find them. You start with common ground, and then you bring them back home. You'd bring a flashlight You'd speak gently. You might even bring some water with you. You guide them step by step until they're home again, because that's what persuasion is meant to do. You go get the person that you care about, and you bring them right along with you. Guinness echoes this vision when he writes, people must be won to the truth personally as well as persuaded intellectually. And this is such a beautiful picture. We're not just defending a thesis, we're standing up for the character of God in a world that has misrepresented him. Understanding that changes the way students should write. It makes them more careful in their tone, more honest about their limitations, more willing to begin with shared assumptions and not just declarations. And it reminds them that winning an argument at the expense of the listener's soul, it isn't success, it's failure. Persuasion only is persuasion if someone changes their mind. Rhetoric isn't just a tool. I like to say that it's a testimony in some ways. When students learn to write this way, they stop asking questions like, how do I sound smart? Or how can I make this sound true? They stop defending their position and they start serving the truth. They stop trying to impress their friends or maybe their teacher and try to start understanding their audience. This is the kind of rhetoric that forms leaders and not just students. It's the kind of rhetoric that equips students to enter college, the workplace, the pulpit, or public life with integrity and grace. And it's the kind of rhetoric that we need now more than ever. Many students, here's another issue that I've found with students. So the first one is that they kind of preach to the choir. The other one is students have something that we call reporter syndrome. They're trained to write like reporters and not reasoners. They are fantastic at summarizing information, but they don't analyze information. They collect facts, but they don't engage ideas. They mimic structure, but they don't risk original thought. In short, they write to sound correct, but not to persuade. Have you noticed that about students when they get an idea, they want to prove something, and then they go collect all the evidence and try to throw as much evidence as possible to prove their case, and it's just a lot of information without really analyzing it, looking at it from another angle, and considering, now, this evidence proves my case, but what if someone doesn't agree with me? What is their case? What is it that they believe? Do I need to investigate that? Most people don't think they're being morons when they believe something, right? I mean, most people don't. They think they believe what's actually true. So if you really care about the person, sometimes it's worth exploring why they believe what they believe. Not to change your opinion and your convictions, again, without compromise, without fear, and without pride. We should be good persuaders. But we do need to understand, did they come to those beliefs honestly in some way? And what do I need to know about what they think so that I can better serve them? That goes back to the definition. Observing, right? The faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. What does that person need to hear? There's a book called Writing Across the Curriculum. It's a national study of college writing. It's by Dan Melzer. And this is really just a study that I read at one point. In a study of 1,000, it was actually 2,000 different writing assignments that were given out across college campuses, he describes that there is a dominance of modernist report writing. Modernist versus alternative writing. Here's how he defines modernist and alternative writing. Modernist report writing is thesis-driven, impersonal. It's often just regurgitating information and knowledge. It favors documentation over discovery, and it prioritizes correctness over wonder. Alternative research writing, by contrast, begins with a question, explores the tension, welcomes creative synthesis, it values originality and new insight and not just an accurate summary. Guess which one actually persuades? It's the latter. Alternative writing with synthesis and discovery. If you're familiar with rhetoric, and some of you have taught rhetoric, I mentioned that there's the 5 canons of rhetoric. The first one is invention. The role of invention. It's one of the principles of classical rhetoric, and it trains students to generate ideas, not just gather them. Very often, if you ask a student what paper they're going to write, what topic they're going to write on, they will tell you their conclusion. Right? They'll tell you the conclusion. What they don't tell you is, I'm interested in exploring this question. They tell you what they want to prove. That's not invention. That's not discovery. When we go about it the way of the modernist writing, it teaches students to just generate ideas and just gather those ideas. Instead of teaching them to ask better questions, we just ask them to leap right to answers. And very often they don't have to learn anything along the way to do that. They've come already decided what it is that they believe about something and why. Or what they've heard is what their why is from someone else. Sometimes they've done some research on what they believe. Have we all heard the phrase confirmation bias before? Right? We just need a couple of different confirmations that what we believe is true, and then it's a done deal, right? What we want to do is ask students to explore what the other options, what the other questions are, what are the other answers that folks are going to come to, and why. Again, not to change their minds, but because if their goal is to actually persuade someone else, they probably need to know that more than they need to know what they already believe. Instead of writing a generic persuasive paper on why drugs are bad, and we would all agree drugs are bad, a student might ask instead, why do cultures historically turn to substances during periods of chaos? Or what can a Christian anthropology say about addiction and desire? That would be the question to maybe precipitate, and they will probably get to the end conclusion that drugs are not good, right? They can still answer that question, but they might want to start with a different question rather than starting with the basic, what do I believe about gun control? What do I believe about abortion? What do I believe about drug use? What do I believe about transgender issues? We could ask some different questions to get at some of the actual issues. And I want to say also, when we're talking about student papers at the K-12 level, particularly high school level, these massive, sweeping, complex political issues, I wouldn't even let them be an option for students to write about. If they were simple for everybody to understand, they wouldn't be hotly debated, and nobody's going to get to the answer of that question in 5 pages and about 8 or 9 paragraphs. It's just not going to be done. Encourage them to find something else and leave those conversations for other times and other places. Those are long, complex conversations. Find other topics for your students to write on in the class. One of the reasons students resist invention is because they have been conditioned to think that their job is to have all the answers. They don't understand that their job is to ask better questions. That's what you really want out of your students. You want them to be students who ask the best questions, not the one who always has the quick answer that'll let's just get this conversation finished right now. I know the answer already. What are the right questions? How can we plumb the depths here? What else is there to explore? When we don't do this, it leads to very cliche, very predictable, very stagnated kinds of writing, very flat, uninteresting papers, and they're going to be bored. Do you want to read another paper about the exact same topic? I mean, how many of you are English teachers, writing teachers of some kind? How many of you have read, this maybe will be dating me, I remember almost every student for at least a decade, I had at least one kid in every class who wanted to write about why Harry Potter was a good series and should be allowed to be read, even though it was about witches. Did anybody else have students who wanted to write about that? Make the argument for that? No. I had another one. Every single year it was why fairy tales should still be read by adults. Anybody? No? Maybe these are not the issues that your students are really, my students really wanted to make sure that they had the liberty to read Harry Potter. Okay. I grant you they can read a Harry Potter. It was the exact same paper for decades on end. You probably have the greatest hits list from your students that they go to every single year. What is it, if you've already read the paper a dozen times and they've probably already had the conversation a dozen times, will they be interested in the assignment that you're giving them? That's the question that we have to ask. If you're going to be bored by it, are they going to be bored by it? Maybe. Here's a thought for you to think about when we think about sort of flat, cliche, predictable, stagnated, unimaginative writing. The tech giant, Apple, everybody's familiar with Apple, I'm sure, right? There was one internship that they opened one year. They received 15,000 applications for one internship slot. 2/3 of every one of those applications had something in common. 10,000 of the 15,000 used this phrase: "This would be a dream come true." Apple discarded every single one of them. Not because they were unqualified, but because they lacked originality. They failed the test of creativity with that one sentence. They played it safe, and they were cut immediately. This is what part of what happens when students don't go through the invention process and start to ask better questions and instead want to get to the answer as soon as possible. Rhetorical invention pushes back against that, and it invites students to move beyond cliche into wonder and curiosity, and it demands that they find the tension and the insight and the overlooked angle. And that kind of thinking will be persuasive. It will be powerful. Os Guinness says, he goes on to sort of add this, that how is this relevant when students are trying to persuade someone to adopt a new way of thinking about things? We start by assuming our students are motivated by the truth and that they want to help someone who lives in wrong belief to adopt a right belief. So in his book, he explores what he calls the anatomy of unbelief. He doesn't just talk about what people believe. He looks at how people believe and why they resist the truth. That's what persuasion needs, to look at how people believe and why they resist the truth. He writes, "At the heart of sin and disobedience is a flagrantly deliberate and continuing act of violence to truth." That phrase, violence to truth, it's not hyperbole, it's a theological reality. Guinness names 4 abuses of truth: suppression, exploitation, inversion, and the last one, self-deception. Unbelief abuses truth through a deliberate act of deception that ends in its own self-deception. In other words, people don't lie, but when they believe lies, they become their own. And this is where we need to find out more about the audience for whom we are writing. What is it that they believe? They came by it, again, probably honestly. They didn't go out of their way to make the wrong, bad decision, more than likely. But something happened along the way, and now there is a self-deception involved somewhere. How can your students get past that when they are trying to be persuasive? And I'm not saying that this is easy. As I stand up here and talk about this, I'm thinking about friends of mine who are not believers, or friends of mine who differ with me on any manner of things. Being persuasive it's not an easy task, but it won't be made easier just by ignoring the how of how someone got to their beliefs and ignoring that part of it, just sort of steamrolling by it and just giving out information instead. When students ask hard questions, when they explore tension, when they admit complexity, they're pushing back against the cultural habit of self-deception. They're honoring reality rather than denying it. They're honoring reality. Think about quite a bit of what's going on in our society today. There's a fair amount of not honoring realities that's at play. Very often our students would honor certain realities. Maybe in this, the case that I'm thinking of is maybe, how many genders there are. And yet they might not be honoring the realities of the complexities of others, of circumstances. When they give in there and don't honor the realities of complication, it does become easier for them to begin denying realities in other spheres of their life as well. It's important to acknowledge the complexities. It's important to push back against those cultural habits of self-deception rather than denying it. Rhetoric at its best is not just persuasive, it's truth revealing. And in a post-truth world, that makes rhetoric very countercultural. This is also why the charge, defend your thesis, is often confusing to students. Peter does tell us in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to give a defense for the faith that is within us and to do so with gentleness and respect. Defense in that verse means argument. Be prepared to give reasons, right? To be prepared to give reasoned argument. But when we use the word defense, sometimes it sets students up to think that their job is to guard the castle, brace for impact. It suggests that they're under attack and that their posture should be defensive, reactive, or even combative. Classical rhetoric, though, offers a better image. The student as a guide, not defending the castle, but leading someone down a path, not bracing for attack, but offering insights with gentleness and courage. Guinness captures this when he writes, "We are not merely answer givers, we are witness bearers." That means that our arguments should not only be rational, but they should be relational. Our tone should not only be firm, but also gracious. And our goal should never be to just win, but it should be to invite. So back in my classroom, I challenged my students to look for the rhetorical puzzles in their arguments and the arguments of others. That's the moment when they can sense that the clarity has broken down, when assumptions are abundant, when insight is missing. And I gave them some frameworks. We have to ask students these questions. What is the issue at hand? Are there irrelevancies being introduced into the arguments that you're building or someone else has built? What contradictions do you need to face in your own arguments? What contradiction is someone not facing in their argument? What assumptions are positioned as proven truths when in fact they're not? These are really big questions, especially to address when you're in conversation with someone, because you don't have a chance to kind of push pause, take some notes, go back and listen again, make sure you heard it correctly. This is hard work to do when you're in active conversation. It is much easier to do when you're writing and preparing, but this is part of that editing process. Most of our students are editing for syntax and sentence structure, which is a part of rhetoric. There's arrangements and style. But should also be a part of the invention process where you have students and you as teachers who are speaking into the works that your students are doing and really challenging them about their assumptions and the irrelevancies that they're introducing. Holding them accountable for what it is that they're saying, making sure that their argument is valid. This kind of invention training makes students better thinkers and better writers and better persuaders, but more than that, it makes them better witnesses, especially if it has to do with something that is related to their faith. Guinness says that our culture doesn't just need more content, it needs more clarity. We are glutted with information and starving for meaning. Teaching rhetoric the classical way with invention at its heart is one of the best ways to stave off that hunger. How we frame arguments can subtly shift the narrative. It invites a new lens and sometimes a false one. What are we doing here? Teaching students. Yeah, here we go. This is why teaching students about rhetorical framing is so important, because if they're not conscious of how arguments are framed by others or themselves, they will unconsciously absorb falsehoods and possibly even reproduce them. And if they're not careful with how they frame the gospel, the truth, or even simple ideas, they may unintentionally push people away. Rhetoric teaches students to ask, what is really being said? How is it being presented? What's missing? And how does this structure or the argument shape its meaning? That question of what's missing, I think, is a really important question. Very often we edit for what's there. We don't edit for what isn't there. We don't ask the question of what's been omitted and how that might impact the argument. The truth can be twisted not only by lies, but by framing, tone, or selective emphasis. The truth can be twisted not only by lies, but by framing, tone, or by selective emphasis. And you've seen this by framing. We have the Declaration of Independence in the United States. Some very beautiful words written by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Beautiful words. He did not mean all men when he wrote those words. He meant white landholding men. He didn't mean all men when he wrote them. Now, we have adapted that language and we see the deeper truth that was being revealed in what he said, and we honor that language. But we do have to be careful when we lift something out of context. We do need to acknowledge when the message of something has been reframed and recast in a different light. I'm very happy to be able to reframe his language and expand on the deeper truth that is actually there. He was ahead of his time. He was saying a truth that he didn't even know was fully true. But we do have to understand that the framing there does change in the 21st century as opposed to the 18th century. In my experience, students often fail to persuade, not because their content is wrong, but because that framing can be very weak. They write essays, again, we said, assuming everyone already agrees with their moral framework. They'll quote possibly scripture, but other quotations out of context or connection, and they use a defensive tone when their audience isn't attacking them. And that can very often undermine their message. I've told my students that they can have the most logical, evidence-rich paper in the world, but if their tone is arrogant, dismissive, or preachy, no one is going to be persuaded to agree with them. Tone is part of that framing, and rhetorical training helps students adjust that tone, not to soften the truth, but to serve the audience that they're trying to persuade. One of the most powerful ideas in Fool's Talk is that apologetics should be understood as advocacy and not simply argument. Apologetics, Guinness writes, is a reasoned defense mounted on behalf of the one who we love, who is innocent, but who has been falsely and unfairly accused. Of course, he's speaking of Christ. He's talking about relational language and moral language. For many students, when they choose their topics and write papers, they aren't just building arguments, they're stepping into essentially a courtroom where, in many cases, they feel like the character of God might be on trial. And they are trying to offer defenses for the truth. That is an awesome task that they are taking on. When they try to argue for one of those moral truths, they're not just defending an idea in the abstract anymore. They need to understand that their words then should offer clarity about who God actually is, his love, his goodness, his justice, his beauty. And now their writing and speaking has become a humbling and holy task. It's why we have to teach rhetoric, because students will be called to testify in classrooms, dorm rooms, conference rooms, family dinners, social media. They're going to be asked to give reasons for their hope, and they do need to be ready. But not with slick talking points or borrowed slogans, but with the kind of rhetorical character that Paul describes in 2 Corinthians. We are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. So how do we teach students to do this? As we said, it begins with tone, with asking them, who are you writing for? And then asking, what does that person or that group need to hear, not just intellectually, but emotionally? It means helping them distinguish between winning and inviting. It means practicing reframing, taking tired conversations and kind of turning them sideways so that the light can break in a little bit. It means reminding them again and again that you are representing the truth. You are the ambassador. How can you be the ambassador with love? There's 3 core themes that I wanted to go over, forming Christian persuaders. There's hospitality, ethos, and courage. Hospitality is the posture of the Christian persuasion. Ethos is the heart of credibility, and courage as the essential virtue for our cultural moment. If we don't train our students to embody these 3 things, hospitality, credibility, and courage, they may have all the skills of rhetoric, but they won't have the soul of a persuader. So let's go through each one. Hospitality. So Oz says something that redefined how I think about persuasion and rhetoric. He says, particularly with Christian persuasion, it's not recruitment, it's an invitation to a feast. And Peter mentioned this earlier. Let's let that image of the feast. Charlotte Mason talks about this as well, laying a feast before children, if you're a Charlotte Mason fan. So much of what passes for Christian argumentation today can feel like convincing people to adopt our language, vote our way, adopt our stances. But Guinness invites us to see persuasion not as transactional, but as a table. Not as a battle, but as a banquet to extend. Rhetoric in this light is hospitality. It's setting the table for someone else to encounter truth, maybe for the first time. And they may not come all the way to your side after just one meal. But isn't that how friendships are born, right? With repeated acts of hospitality, because you actually care. This is why tone matters and framing matters and why empathy matters, not because we're softening the truth, but because we're inviting someone who is hungry, and they might not even know that they're hungry from all the junk food, as Peter said earlier, but inviting them to come and finally eat. And when students understand that, that can really be a change. Is their paper, is their speech an extension of hospitality? In practical terms, I've seen this work in student writing when we intentionally reframe their audience. Instead of saying, write a persuasive essay on whatever issue it is, I ask them to write a letter to someone that they love who disagrees with them and persuade them gently, honestly, and respectfully. And this is what we see on social media as well. People will say things on social media that they would never say to another human person in real life, in person. right? Because there is an anonymity to that social distance when you just fire off a zinger to someone on social media and you can just cut them down, but you would never talk that way to somebody if you were face to face with them. This is bringing the humanity back to the rhetoric, back to their paper, and saying, don't write this for an abstract audience. Write this for someone you love. Pretend it's someone that you really care about, and write that paper that way. Write a letter to them. The tone softens, the thinking deepens, the writing becomes human. Suddenly, they're not writing from a soapbox anymore. They're writing from the seat next to someone that they care about. That's hospitality. Ethos. In classical rhetoric, ethos is the credibility of the speaker. Aristotle placed it alongside the logos and the pathos as the three essential appeals of persuasion. And while logos and pathos often can be taught through mechanics like structure and evidence and illustration, ethos is different. Ethos isn't about what you say. It's about who you are when you say it. Students sometimes assume that if they have a strong thesis and good sources, their writing will be persuasive, but ethos is what determines whether the audience trusts them. And trust matters more than ever in our current culture. In fact, Guinness argues that one of the reasons that persuasion is failing in public spheres is because witnesses don't have character anymore. He writes, the deepest issue is not whether our arguments are strong, but whether our lives are credible. And Brian was just talking about this in his talk. Apologies, I'm nursing a bit of a cold. This is especially true for Christian students. If they are defensive, sarcastic, or unkind, it won't matter how right they are. They won't persuade. Ethos is built through honesty, admitting where the issue is complex, humility, acknowledging opposing views fairly, clarity, articulating ideas with precision and grace. And ethos isn't just for public arguments, it's for classroom papers, casual conversations, social media posts, and all of life. Here's a very quick example. A few years ago, a student of mine wrote an essay on physician-assisted suicide. She was opposed to it. Her reasoning was sharp. Her statistics were on point, her structure was airtight, but her tone was condescending, reductionist. It assumed that the answer to lifelong, intense, chronic pain was just a simple mind over matter issue for people. She was 15 years old. She didn't intend to come across this way, but her writing was dripping with moral superiority. Her argument sounded like, how could you not see this? Instead of, here's why I think this really matters. And we had a long conversation, and I asked her to imagine that the reader of this paper was not going to be me, the person who agreed with her, but I asked her to imagine if it was a mother who had had to watch a terminally ill child suffer through a painful death. And I asked her to rewrite that same paper, not changing her argument, but changing her tone, as if she was speaking to that mother. And the result was one of the most beautiful, respectful, persuasive papers that I have ever read. And she was 15. It was truly, it transformed me. It was the same argument, the same sources, but her ethos had changed. She wasn't just right, she was persuasive. And that's ethos in action. The last is courage, and this is preparing for the pushback. It would be easy to end this talk on a high note about winsome writing and hopeful witness, but let's be honest, when our students are going to speak the truth with grace, they will still face opposition. And sometimes there's going to be some fierce opposition. In fact, one of the most important things that we can teach our students is that a faithful persuasion is awfully very costly. Guinness doesn't sugarcoat this. He reminds us that Christian persuasion happens in a world that is not neutral. We have to remember that. We're not engaging in a neutral sphere of conversation out there. We are stepping not into friendly conversations, but we are walking into contested spaces very often. He writes, "We must be prepared for the cost. Those who follow the fool's way must be prepared to be a fool in the eyes of the world." This is a call to courage. And courage is not arrogance. Courage is the willingness to speak even when it's hard, to love someone enough to risk being misunderstood, to ask better questions even if it disrupts conversations. Teaching courage in the classroom, how do we teach this? We have to affirm students when they write something bold and true. We have to model what it looks like to hold conviction with humility, inviting hard conversations, praising respectful disagreement, and showing them that persuasion is not always about being liked, but it's about being faithful. Every small act of courage builds rhetorical resilience, and that's what we need most. In the end, the best persuaders are not those with the fanciest words or the flawless outlines. They're the people who know what they believe, love the person in front of them, and speak truth with clarity and grace, no matter the cost. They are the people who prepare the table, and our students can be those people. We've traveled far in this talk, from Aristotle to Apple, from invention to ethos, but let's return to where we started. Why do we teach rhetoric? Not because it guarantees good grades, not even because it produces excellent writing, though it does. We teach rhetoric because we are training students to speak truth in a world that's allergic to it. We are preparing young people to walk into college classrooms and social conversations. We're teaching them to bring clarity where there's confusion and beauty where there's brokenness. One of the last things that I want to go note for you is that as we start to close, let me share a thought from one of my favorite thinkers, G.K. Chesterton. He was witty, joyful, brilliant, and wildly persuasive. Are you familiar with G.K. Chesterton? He once said that a good argument should feel like a paradox unfolding, like turning a corner in your mind and seeing something shocking but suddenly obvious. He also said that the object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid. That's what rhetoric does. It opens minds not to drift endlessly, but to land on truth, solid truth, not shifting sand. And Chesterton's style of teaching teaches us something, that persuasion can be playful. It can be joyful, that it can surprise and disarm and delight. Our students need that. The world needs that. Because in a culture where arguments are often angry or tired or cynical, joy is persuasive. Wonder is persuasive. Hope is persuasive. And so is love. When we teach rhetoric, we're doing more than prepping students for college. We're forming peacemakers who can speak in conflict, storytellers who can reframe the false narratives, ambassadors who carry not only their own message, but also the message of the gospel. We are sending out students who will be misunderstood and misrepresented, possibly mocked. But if we've trained them well, we'll form their hearts. And so this is my benediction to all teachers of rhetoric. May your students learn to speak the truth in love. May they be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. May their words be gracious, seasoned with salt. May they reason like Paul, speak like Jesus, and write like Chesterton. I wish I could do that. And may they never forget that persuasion is not about winning, it's about inviting someone to the feast. And I think it's going to be lunchtime, so it's perfect.
Does anyone have any burning questions for Joelle before the rest of the group come up to join us? Yes.
In rhetoric, is there a pathway for when you are discussing with somebody and then you realise you're the one out in the woods and they're the one in the cave?
I think that's called humility. I think that is the art, right? Is and this happens to me more, and the more I think I know, the more I realize I don't. And I think that is just the call to walk in humility and to acknowledge I have something to learn here. One of my favorite phrases that I've picked up over the years is, "I didn't know that, educate me." It's very disarming for people as soon as you say that and you really lean in and you say it sincerely. They're delighted that, oh, sure, I'm okay. They might not even know what to say. It's very rare for somebody, I think, these days to just say, I don't know. Please educate me. Help me see what you see. I'd love to know more. Especially if it is somebody that you disagree with. And even if you're right, I still say that to them because I still want to know how they got there. I want to know why they believe what they believe. I can't even begin to think about how to pray for them, how to counsel them, how to encourage them if I don't know. So even when I disagree and I'm not convinced I'm in the wrong maybe yet, I still ask people to educate me. Tell me what you think and why. It's what is it? There's that quote, and I'm going to butcher it. It's the sign of an educated mind that you're able to entertain an idea without accepting it. Isn't that an Aristotelian quote? I sound smart, don't I? But I think that's what we're really looking for there, right? Is to be able to hear the idea, entertain it, and not think that just because we try it on that all of a sudden we've compromised ourselves. We can have those conversations. Yes, sir.
How much time would you recommend? Like you said, year 9, year 10, I think it was Rhetoric 1. I think you referred to the year 12 or something, Rhetoric 2 maybe. But how much time a week would you recommend you give your students to go through, say, Rhetoric 1 in a year? Just roughly.
Sure. So I think very often that we silo our disciplines. And so we have, logic class over here and math class here and then rhetoric class. So I do think that there needs to be some time for rhetorical instruction. But the way that the students are probably going to learn it best is if all of the teachers in the upper school are expecting the same kinds of writing and the same standard across the disciplines so that they can have perhaps maybe 1 or 2 days a week where they have formal instruction, but they know that the paper that they write in English or history or science or whatever the classes that they're taking, that those teachers are going to be holding the students to the same kind of standard that the rhetoric teacher would hold them to. And maybe there's a double grade in there where there's coordination between the different teachers. That does cut down on the amount of exclusive time that has to be set aside to just give them practice time for rhetoric. If they're going to be writing papers anyway, and they are, why not cross-pollinate a little bit? We have time for one more question, if there is one. Yes, ma'am.
Any thoughts on how we could start to move this to the younger grades? Like, I know that they might not be ready to write paper, but just forming their ideas. How do you teach that humility, I guess? Having strong opinions from their parents.
Yes, they do.
Very strong opinions on whether or not Trump is a good president, and it's like, you're how do we sort of open that discussion up or that thought process up when they're very much like what mum and dad say?
Sure. That is a tough question because they are parrots, right? They're going to come in and they know what they think about absolutely everything. There is a little bit of nuance to, and some of that is higher order, where you're asking them to suspend belief, to think more abstractly, to reason through something. And some children, like the younger children, are just not going to be developmentally ready to be able to do some of that kind of work. There might be spaces where we're not going to engage in some of those kinds of conversations, and we're going to refocus them maybe on something where they are undecided. Maybe it's the stick bud that they never seen, or whatever it is that. But teaching them, they don't have to be taught. You might not win that battle, and you might have to let that go. But there are things where they don't have an opinion yet, and you can be teaching them how to explore, to ask the right questions, and engage with something afresh and anew, knowing that now you're really starting to maybe form new habits that they might carry with them as they get older. And then when they are teenagers, then you can push back when they're ready to be able to sort of nuance a little bit better and ask them to apply some of what they've been learning all through that grammar school phase to some of that more mature mind that they have. But that could be a losing battle too, and parents might not like it. You know, if you're asking them to hold, you could just have sort of a no-fly zone on certain things, and then I think people somewhat understand that, and then you leave yourself space to build new habits.